Jesus for the cleansing power. Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace this hour? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb?
And in 1 Corinthians 15, we were looking at this concept of the resurrection. And we posited the idea last week that as Paul shifts focus from these disorders in worship from chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14, now he's focusing on the gospel and the resurrection and how important the resurrection is to the gospel. The problem is that in Corinth, many of the people there in the church and especially in the society understood that the body, the physical body, the flesh and blood, would not be able to enter the celestial realm of heaven itself. And so they were questioning, how can there be a resurrection? If the physical cannot dwell the spiritual, then how can there possibly be a resurrection? So Paul addresses this issue with, first of all, the centrality of resurrection to the gospel itself. I delivered unto you of first importance that Jesus died and was buried and was raised and was seen. Remember in the first 4 verses of chapter 15. So resurrection was an imperative part. In fact, he says, and you understood those things. You believed those things. When I preached them just like that, you accepted it. And so now from the time of their conversion to this point in their lives, as often happens, the devil goes to work, doesn't he? When we obey the gospel, the devil has lost a soul that he once had. And so he goes into full-time work to try to recover him or her because of that conversion, because that person has left his clutches and he wants them back. And so here's the Corinthians. They are experiencing a full onslaught from the devil himself. And he has convinced them that their old way of thinking, that the body, the physical, cannot inherit the spiritual. Therefore, how can there possibly be a resurrection? And so Paul goes into several different arguments, and we got through kind of the first one last week, where he deals with these, if there is no resurrection, then Christ is not raised. If there is no resurrection, then our faith is in vain. Culminating with that, if there is no resurrection, then we are among all men the most to be pitied. People should look upon us with such pity and compassion because we have believed in the biggest hoax and accepted the biggest lie that the world has ever known. We are the most to be pitied if that is our only hope. But the fact is, he says in verse 20, Christ has been raised. His second argument, I guess you would say, is that Jesus is the first fruits. We were looking at last week how first fruit implies what? Okay, that he's the first one of what? Others to follow. When we say first fruit, there's an implication of a second fruit or a third fruit or a fourth fruit, right? That there's more to come. And that's Paul's point. Jesus was the first with a promise of more to come. And so he deals with it from that aspect. In verse 29, where we start tonight, we come across one of those passages that is difficult for many to understand. He says, otherwise, if there's no resurrection, and he says, but there is a resurrection, otherwise, what do people mean by being baptized on behalf of the dead if the dead are not raised at all? Why are people baptized on their behalf? And so we start asking the question, what is this baptism of the dead? What does it mean to be baptized for the dead or baptized on their behalf? It's a difficult one, isn't it? There's an entire religious groups built around the idea of baptism for the dead. If you're doing genealogical research today, what is the best place to go to for the fullest complement of records in American heritage? Salt Lake City. What's in Salt Lake City? The Mormon Temple. Why is it the best place to go? Because their genealogical tables are the most extensive in the world, really. Why do they keep them up to date? Have you ever asked that question? That's exactly right. They practice baptism on behalf of the dead. And so there is a continual stream of people who are volunteering to be baptized over and over and over. And each one, they're looking at the genealogical tables of the people that have died. I'm going to baptize you on behalf of person A. They baptize him. That person comes up. Now I'm going to baptize you in the name of, or on behalf of person B. And they baptize him, raise him up. Now I'm going to baptize you on behalf of person C. And they do this almost. Oh yeah, anyone that they can volunteer, and this is almost a continual 24-hour basis, because look how many people have died. I mean, there's a lot of dead people in the history of humanity. And if we can get a name or an identity of some sort, they baptize on behalf of the dead in hopes to release souls from purgatory. And the justification for that, of course, is right here in verse 29. Baptism on behalf of the dead. This is often referred to as a vicarious baptism. We often hear vicarious in connection with suffering. The vicarious suffering of Jesus means what? Yes, that Jesus suffered for us. And so if vicarious suffering means Jesus suffered for us, vicarious baptism means that someone else was baptized for us, or that we are being baptized for someone else. It's a proxy. It's not the actual person, it's someone on their behalf. Some have suggested that that's exactly what Paul is intending here, that we need to have that vicarious proxy baptism. And those who are doing that, why in the world would they baptize for someone who's already dead if they didn't already believe in the resurrection? See, that's the argument he's making. Why would you baptize on behalf of the dead if there's no resurrection? There's obviously great issues with that. The first being that obedience to the gospel is always by those who can make the decision and obey. That is one of the great arguments against infant baptism. Is infants cannot reason and justify in their minds, you know what, I'm a sinner. I have fallen short of what God has prepared for me, and I need to get rid of my sins, therefore I will be baptized. The primacy of the soul, of the individual, to make that choice, to make that decision and submit to baptism has to be there. Well, if it has to be there for a child, for an infant, and it's not, because an infant doesn't reason that way, would it not also stand to reason that a dead person cannot reason that way? What's the plan of salvation? It begins with hear, and then what? Believe. How can someone who is physically dead believe? There's no thought processes going on, right? There's no belief there. They can't make the conscious choice. They cannot believe. They cannot take actions to bring forth fruits worthy of repentance, as John commanded, that we are changing our lives. They can't do that. And so if the individual can't do that, then certainly we understand that they can't obey the gospel. In Ezekiel, he makes an argument about who's going to bear whose sins, right? And he says, the son shall not bear the iniquity of his father, nor the father the iniquity of his son. The righteousness of the righteous will be where? On him. And the wickedness of the wicked will be upon him. In other words, we cannot be righteous enough, so righteous, that our righteousness spills over and affects our spouse and makes them righteous against their will. That it spills over and affects our children against their will. Or spills back into the dead and converts them against their will. Our righteousness, my righteousness, your righteousness, is only applied to me, mine to me, you to yours, yours to you, I'm sorry. Yes, it's all individual choice. So vicarious baptism just it flies in the face of everything else that the Bible talks about and teaches about individual responsibility. So this idea of vicarious, baptized on behalf of the dead so that they are released from some sort of purgatory or holding cell in the afterlife so that they might enter into heaven, simply does not fit. Some have suggested that it's Paul is making reference to what the society of Corinth believed. There are some who have suggested that Corinth was a society that was very infatuated with death. Certainly we've seen societies and cultures that celebrate death and things like that, and so that's not uncommon to us or unfathomable. And that because of that, the people of Corinth would baptize, very much like the vicarious baptism of Mormons today, that they were baptizing for other people. And Paul is just trying to show the inconsistency. Why would you be baptized, or why would they, the Corinthians, which have not obeyed the gospel, which are influencing you to say that there is no resurrection, if they believe there's no resurrection, then why are they baptizing for the dead? Possibly that's what is happening, that Paul is just making a reference to something that is unbiblical and outside of God, and he's just using it to show the silliness of those who are rejecting the resurrection. And I guess that's possible, but I get the thing that I question about that is why would Paul bring up something that is not founded in God and use it just to score points for an argument when he doesn't really believe that there's anything happening on being baptized on behalf of the dead, especially without saying something in rebuttal to it. Else, why should they be baptized for the dead or on behalf of the dead if there is no resurrection, even though being baptized for the dead accomplishes nothing? There's no statement like that. There's no caveat from Paul that says that this practice was unfounded in God, that it was not biblical, that it wasn't part of the Christian religion. There's nothing here that Paul, he's dead silent. He just mentions that people are being baptized on behalf of the dead. And that brings us down to a third option, that those who are dead are being baptized, which is probably the most accurate, because the Bible very clearly tells us that we are dead in our trespasses and sins, and that Paul is making reference to all of those who are Christians. Why are they, these Christians, in Corinth, in Rome, in Philippi, in Ephesus, in Jerusalem, why are these Christians everywhere? Why are they the result of being baptized for their death? It is true that we crucify the old man of sin, right? That we put him to death. We bury him in the waters of baptism, and we are raised to walk in a newness of life. In other words, he's talking about the baptism of the Great Commission. why do we go through all of those steps? Why do we, as Christians, we look back at our lives, and as Paul reminded the Romans of what they had done in Romans chapter 6, being, dying, being buried, and being raised to walk in the newness of life, or in Colossians 2, and he says, we are buried with him, therefore, in baptism, and raised in newness. Why did we do all that? With the hope of a resurrection in the future, right? We're hoping, we're counting on there being a resurrection. Exactly. We believe there is a resurrection in our future, and therefore, we went through. We have heard. You remember the Festus when he heard. Felix. When Felix heard Paul's preaching, he shook with fear, but he didn't obey. Agrippa would say, almost, you got me to that point. What are they hearing? They're hearing the gospel that Jesus came, that he died, that he was resurrected, and he did all that because each one of us are sinners. And at the resurrection, we're going to go to hell, but Jesus gives us an opportunity of the resurrection to go to heaven. That's why they were scared to death. We hear those words and we say, well, you know what? I want to go to heaven. Because I believe there is a resurrection coming. I want to make sure that my eternity is spent in heaven. Otherwise, if there's no resurrection, why are we baptized? Why do we obey the gospel? Why do we become Christians if when you're dead, you're just dead? Right? That's Paul's statement. So in verse 30, the ESV that I read out of says, why am I in danger every hour? But the original language in the updated ESVs, I've got a first edition here, so mine's it's been updated. But it's actually the first person plural. Why are we living in danger? Well, what danger are we in? Well, look at his next verse. I protest, brothers, by my pride in you, which I have in Christ Jesus our Lord. I die every day. What do I gain if, humanly speaking, I fought with beasts at Ephesus, if the dead are not raised? What danger are we living in? Paul would go through, for example, in 2 Corinthians, he says, I've been beaten, I've been left for dead, I've been stoned, I've been in perils in the wilderness, I've been in perils in the deep, in the oceans, I've been shipwrecked. He goes through all the things that he has faced just because he's a Christian. You think about, what if Paul had never obeyed the gospel and continued to live out his life in Jerusalem, surrounded by people who loved him, cared for him, on the council, the Sanhedrin council in Jerusalem, no peril, no danger, how easy his life would have been. But the gospel called him out of that comfort zone and to go into the world and reach those who were lost in their sins. He says, we are in danger every single day. We jeopardize our lives to be Christians. All who live godly in this present world shall suffer persecution. Right? That's Paul's great statement. If you're doing it right, you will be in danger. And there's an anxiety. He says, besides those things which press on me from without, in 2 Corinthians 11, what is there? What does he say? There's that which presses on me from within, which is, remember what he says? The anxiety or the care for the churches. There's this deep appreciation for the church, and he says I'm protesting this concept of there being no resurrection because of my pride in you, because I want you to understand there is a resurrection. I die every day. I'm pressed upon by my love for you and my tenderness for you and desire for you to be saved. And if I fight beasts at Ephesus, did Christians fight beasts? Yeah. They were thrown to the lions. Now, is Paul referring to the beast of the gladiatorial games in Ephesus or Rome, and it was thrown to them? one of the arguments against that is by Roman law, if you were thrown to the lions, you lost your citizenship. But what does Paul do in the book of Acts? He claims his citizenship, so he hasn't lost it. And so some have suggested that Paul didn't actually face beasts in Ephesus, a Colosseum in Ephesus, but rather he's referring to those beasts, those humans, those men and women who are attacking the church. That's not far removed from what Paul has used. For example, in Philippians 3 and verse 2, he says, beware of the dogs, beware of the concision. And he's talking about Judaizing teachers, the concept that they're beasts or that they're ravenous. He would say to the elders at Ephesus that after my departure, what will happen? Ravenous wolves will come in. And so to depict false teachers and those who are attacking the church as beasts is not far removed from Paul. So either he is facing actual wild animals in the Colosseum, or he is facing the onslaught of false teachers who are trying to damage the church. Either one, he's saying, look, if I face these things down, if I fight this battle, what good is it if there's no resurrection? Yeah. Then he makes that last statement there in verse 32. If the dead are not raised, let us what? For tomorrow we die. You see, one man said it this way, that in the resurrection there is an endless hope. But if there's no resurrection, there's an hopeless end. And hopelessness, he says, breeds dissipation, immoral living. When there's no hope, there is despair, there's no reason to live righteously toward anybody. When you take away hope, judgment beyond, that there's more than this natural world, people start living for themselves. For we eat and we drink, for tomorrow we die, right? There was a news story that just came out of a man who, because of his gender identity, was starting to use the women's restroom. He was arrested. And he's claiming, I'm a woman. Why? Why would any of us even try to accommodate or accept his explanation? Because if we eat and drink, for tomorrow we die, we do just what we want to do. And all there is this natural world. There's no reason to hold anyone accountable for their decisions. And if you're a man and you feel like you're a woman, or you're a woman and you feel like you're a man, or if you change your gender identities every other day of the week, that's fine. And everyone has to accommodate you. There's no reason to oppose that kind of behavior if there's nothing beyond. That's what Paul is saying. We do all of this because there is something there. We hold ourselves to a greater morality because there is something there. Do not be deceived. This is the third time he said this in the book. And when he says it, it's kind of like Jesus saying, he that has an ear, let him hear. For Paul, it's don't be deceived. Don't go back and look. In chapter 3, it was, do not be deceived. Let him who thinks that he is wise, according to this world. Yeah. Yeah. I think so. We're facing, and as our world, as our society becomes more secularized. Now, secular, it's a Latin term that refers to the right here and now. The seculum mundus. It is the right here and now. Because that's all there is. If there's no resurrection, all we have is the here and now. And as we become more secularized, as we focus on just the here and now with no concept, no thought given to the future, You have the corruption of morality that we have today. And the saddest part isn't just because there's always been people who are abnormal, who are either psychologically imbalanced or are just morally deviant. They've always been here. Men who thought they were women, or women who thought they were men, or men who behaved one way, or they've been here since the beginning. Since the first century, the beginning of the church, deviancy like this has been here. What is happening now, though, is in a secular society, instead of recognizing that as aberrant behavior, we are accommodating that behavior. And the only thing to be intolerant of isn't a guy going into a women's bathroom and exposing himself to little girls. We've got to be tolerant of that. We can't tolerate being judgmental about it. And that's where we're heading in society. I'm sorry if that's a little graphic, but when you read those articles, they hire up the blood a little bit. And but you see, we are living as a direct result of not believing in a resurrection, of not believing in a supernatural, of something greater than our human existence here. And Paul says, if from this earthly viewpoint, if this is all there is, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals. Yeah. Yeah. And God has given everything. I mean, we talked about it last week when we were looking at verses 28. The Son himself is subjected. I mean, Jesus sacrificed his position in the Godhead. Why? For you. And that ought to hit us right here. We ought to recognize how much God loves us and how much he's already done for us. And yes, there's more that he will do for us. But this concept that God hasn't done anything. So, if you run with people, bad company, that deny the resurrection, it is going to corrupt good morals. This is not an aside. It's not just Paul throws this in. The bad company are those who are denying the resurrection, or we might say denying whatever God has stated and doing it. So he says, wake up from your drunken stupor as is right, and do not go on sinning, for some have no knowledge of God. And I say this to your shame. Now, he's told them already in this letter, if you have and you have those that have not, don't let the haves shame the have-nots. Right? That's chapter 11. And now Paul comes in and he's shaming them. Well, it's because they were shaming over carnal, earthly desires. Paul is shaming them for not knowing God. You remember Jesus when he was so exasperated in John 8? He says, why do you not understand what I'm saying? And it's because you can't even hear my words. And why can't you hear my words in verse 47? Because you're not of God. You don't have a relationship with God. You don't desire to be with God. They do not know God. You do err, not knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God, he said to the Sadducees in Mark. They erred because they did not believe in the resurrection, and as a result, they didn't know the Scriptures which talked of the resurrection. They didn't know of the power of God. Not to know God leads to immorality. Because knowing God, they did not honor him as God, and therefore became darkened in their hearts, vain in their reasoning. Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 30. They exchanged the natural use for the unnatural. They honored the creature instead of the Creator. When we do not know God, it leads to immorality. But someone will ask, how are the dead raised? He's going to further into the next argument now about the resurrection being here. Their issue was not just, they didn't believe in a resurrection like the Sadducees. Their issue was they didn't understand how the physical could be raised to a spiritual. So he anticipates an unknown or a hypothetical question. Someone will ask, how are the dead raised? What kind of body do they have? You foolish person, Paul says. It's the teacher speaking to the student. The student has asked a foolish question, but it's not just a question out of ignorance. What does the fool say? There is no God. Psalm 14 verse 1, Psalm 53 and verse 1. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. You foolish person. Why? Because you're not taking into account who? God. He's not foolish because he's ignorant or dullard. He's foolish because he's not accounting for the power of God, which is exactly what Jesus told the Sadducees. You're not accounting for the power of God. Paul brings in that same argument. What you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or of some other grain. Now, Paul has already depicted himself as the farmer planting the seed in chapter 3, so they know this concept of farming. He says, you take a grain of wheat or some other grain, and you look at it, and can you, just by looking at that kernel of wheat, discern what kind of plant is going to come out of that? If you've never seen a wheat plant, you take the wheat seed and say, well, let me tell you what this seed is going to look like when it becomes a plant. No, we don't know that. You look at a corn seed and say, well, I'm going to tell you what the plant's going to look like. We can't. We can't discern that. But the seed goes into the soil, and there it dies, right? Jesus would say in John 12 and verse 24, unless the seed dies, it cannot bring forth the life. And so there's this death of the seed. There is a mystery here. Some might say, well, we've planted seeds and we see how it all works now. Well, yeah, but it's not about how it all works. It's not about being able to take from that seed the genetic material and say, oh, well, this is a corn seed, and then this is... even that doesn't tell us what the plant's going to look like. God chooses the body, and this has been at the creation, what it was going to look like. God gives it its body in verse 38, as he has chosen, and to each kind of its seed its own body. For not all flesh is the same, but there is one kind for humans, another for animals, another for birds, another for fish. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is of one kind, the glory of the earth is of another. He's saying, look, we can't tell by the seed of something what the plant is going to be, and that seed is we might say its first body, and the plant is the second body. We can't tell just by what the original is what the changed is going to be. There is one glory, verse 41, of the sun, another glory of the moon, another glory for the stars, for star differs from star in glory. Not only is there one kind for stars, and we might say for everything else too, but this is the one. Stars have different glories. We know today there's differences between the neutrons and the pulsars, and red dwarfs and white dwarfs and supergiants and novas, and we know that they're different, right? This shows not just the power of God, but the creativity of God. That we don't all look the same. The stars don't all look the same. God has a breadth of creativity, of aesthetics that far surpasses man in his understanding. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown imperishable? Well, we sow. We plant the seed. And so there's a question of, what sowing is he talking about? And some have suggested, well, we take the dead body and we plant it in the ground. We sow the perishable, and then it will eventually be raised imperishable, right? But it really doesn't fit the rest of the argument, because he goes on to talk about the first man, Adam, in verse 45, and the last Adam, and he's making reference back to Genesis 2. And we realize that the sowing isn't us as humans planting dead bodies in the ground. It's God as the Creator, forming man of the dust of the ground and planting him on the earth. That's the sowing. God sowed on this earth us with a perishable body, but he will raise us in the resurrection with an imperishable one. God has sown a life that is given to dishonor. What kind of dishonor is this life given to? Sin. That's right. We dishonor our bodies. But then we will be raised how? Raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, the temptations, the frailties. I got up this morning, slept wrong on my arm. My shoulder's been killing me all day. Walking around like this all day, just holding my arm, just take the pressure off my shoulder. We know the frailties of life, and that's minor, right? We are sown in weakness, but we are raised in power. It is sown, the ESV says, natural body. But here's an interesting thing. The word natural here is actually the word soul. And it's like saying it's a soulish body versus the spiritual one. And what it means is that this body was created, the natural body was created specifically for what? To house our souls. That's what this body is for. And whenever this body, and notice the repetition of the idea of body, when this natural body, this one that holds the soul, is put away or is raised, it will be raised not as a soulish body, but as a spiritual body. One fit for a spiritual realm. The first man, Adam, became a living soul, or living being is what the ESV says, but it's really the same word that he uses up there to describe natural body. Adam was the one that became the living body, the soul, or living soul. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. He's going to contrast these things, and I don't know why we're getting some interference there, but the last Adam became a life-giving spirit. The last Adam is a reference to who? Jesus. John 5:26 says that the Father gave him to have life in himself, meaning he has not just the power of life within him, but the power to give that life to all others as well. Jesus would say in John 11:25, I am the resurrection and the life. That's right. And so he is a life-giving spirit. But the contrast here is about the soul and the spirit. As he said there at the end of verse 44. If there is a natural body, there is also a spiritual body. He is contrasting the poles between them. It is not the spiritual that was first, but the natural, and then the spiritual. The first man was from the earth, a man of dust. The second is from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are of the dust. And as it is the man of heaven, so also are those who are of heaven. Verse 49, just as we have been born the image of the man of dust, so we also shall bear the image of the man of heaven. When will we bear the image of the man of heaven? The resurrection. It's all, remember, keep focused on that. He is bringing up the resurrection. We are born first after the image of Adam, humanity, flesh. But then in that resurrection, we will put on the image of Christ. That is the eternal, the spiritual. I tell you this, brothers. Again, another one of those indicators Paul is drawing their attention. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God, nor does the perishable inherit the imperishable. Paul is agreeing with their first assumption, which is what? The physical cannot inherit the spiritual. I agree with you on that, he's saying. I disagree with your conclusion that there must be no resurrection because you're not accounting for God. That's the foolishness. When we take God into account, what we see is, behold, I tell you a mystery. Listen up, look, this is a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Resurrection is not resuscitation or reanimation of the body. See, that's what a lot of people in the ancient world thought. That believed in a resurrection, that this person is dead, we've buried his body, or we've done whatever funerary rites that we're going to do, and yet in that resurrection, somehow that body is going to be resuscitated. Life is going to re-enter, and it will be reanimated and come back as a body. Paul says resurrection is not reanimation. Why? Because not every one of us is going to die. But every one of us are going to be changed in that resurrection. That's when the resurrection comes. That's it. We didn't get quite to the mocking of death and its sting. So next week we're supposed to do 16. I think we've got. Do we have one Wednesday left or 2 Wednesdays this month? We've got 2 left, right? So I think we can finish 15, and we've got 2 weeks to do 16. So we should be done there. And then I think Rusty's putting together some other classes and stuff. So kind of waiting to see exactly how that all goes. But I do know I'm not teaching this class. I think Corey will be teaching this class next quarter, and that will start in March. Appreciate your attention. We'll pick up there in about verse 50.
Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power? Are you washed in the blood of the Lamb? Are you fully trusting in His grace?